Okay, I'm hoping that this will be less blurred than the pictures on the previous one or two episodes. But here we are again. We're back again with the House of 60 Fathers and Tien Pao. Of course, when we left him, where was he? He was once again adrift in that sampan without his mother and father and without Beauty of the Republic. Just Tien Pao with Glory of the Republic, the little pig, and the ducklings. And he's adrift again in stormy weather in the middle of the night, in the dark, drifting down the river. Where to? The wind began to blow. The wind rushed in with the rain, swept it through the sampan from one end to the other. Tien Pao turned his back to the lashing rain, bowed his head. Dimly he could see the little mirror in the altar to the river god. His lips moved. River god, good river god, the wind, make it push the sampan to shore. Later the wind on the river must have changed, as the sampan seemed to rush in a great sweeping curve. Tien Pao was almost sure that now the sampan was racing into another river. But in the new river the wind fell down from the mountains, crashed down on the sampan in one shrieking blow. In one blow it tore the arched roof of mats off the sampan and flung them down into the river. The mirror on the altar to the river god smashed to bits on the floor. The sampan rushed along wide open to the sky and slashing rain and wind. Rain hurled against the wooden floor. Down from the mountains the rain came in sheets, in torrents. In one moment Tien Pao was soaked. He crawled under the bench. There was no other place to crawl for shelter. He crouched under the bench on hands and knees and pulled Glory of the Republic under him to shelter him from the hard beating rain. He pulled the dishpan before him, kept his hands clenched around the rim. The rain water rose fast in the open sampan. Under him, Glory of the Republic uttered distressed little grunts. But the numbed Tien Pao kept the rope short, kept him where he was. He felt the water flowing over his hands clenched round the dishpan, crawling up his wrists. Now the three ducklings flowed out of the dishpan with the rising rain water. They swam about happily in their new big pool. One behind the other they swam in excited whispering circles through the sampan. Suddenly their peeping stopped and they became very busy. They dived and dipped. Then Pao could hear the tiny clatter of their bills along the floor under the water. At first he paid no attention. Suddenly he pushed the pig out of his way. The ducklings were diving for rice. The water had reached the little shelf under the bench and was washing all the ground rice away. All the rice was lost, his only food. But if the water had reached the shelf, it could sink the sampan. Tien Pao grabbed the dishpan and wildly started bailing the rainwater overboard. He had a scare when he almost scooped a diving duckling overboard with the water. He went at it more quietly, forced himself to make no loud scraping noises. When at last the dishpan began touching the bottom, Tien Pao tried to save some of the gritty rice that had settled to the floor. He found his rice bowl. He drained the watery rice through his fingers, feeling carefully for any glass splinters from the shattered mirror. Crumb by pasty crumb, he gathered half a bowlful of wet rice. And while Tien Pao worked like that, the rain stopped and light came. Morning came to the river. In the first glimmer of the dawn, Tien Pao saw the dim far banks. It was a wide river. It was 3 times wider than the river at Hengyang. But when Tien Pao peered ahead under the morning mists floating up from the river, the great river swept into a still wider river. Rivers, Tien Pao knew, widen as they near the sea, and near the sea were the Japanese. Tien Pao's scalp crawled with horror. Where the 2 rivers finally met, Tien Pao saw a village loom up in the misty dawn. His own village had been at the corner of 2 rivers. His mouth dry with fear, Tien Pao stared at the distant village. It couldn't be his village. The Japanese had burned his village to the ground. But in this village the houses still stood. The sampan swung into the new river. The village came closer. But this wasn't a living village. The houses weren't houses. They were empty, blackened, roofless walls. His village. And there, pacing slowly back and forth along the riverbank, was a Japanese soldier. Behind the sentry lay the gutted village. Tien Pao crouched low in the sampan, but he couldn't keep himself from peering fearfully over the edge. The soldier stopped, stood looking up the river. He took his rifle down. To Tien Pao, crouched in the approaching sampan, it seemed that the soldier was looking right at him, that a shot must come. He couldn't take his horrified eyes off the shoulder. But the sentry merely shifted his rifle to the other shoulder and began pacing again. It broke the horror spell, and as the sentry shifted the gun, Tien Pao made his move. He slid himself flat in the watery bottom of the sampan. He mustn't crouch, mustn't stare over the edge. He kept one arm tightly over the pig so he wouldn't move. Nothing must move. It must be that the rain mists, sifting over the river towards the shore, had hidden the flat, roofless sampan from the staring sentry. But the rain was over. The mist was lifting. Clear, bright light was coming to the river. Nothing must move. As he lay there motionless, his back exposed to the open sky, went rigid with dread. It was again as if he heard the aeroplanes screaming over the treetops, the stutter of bullets, the whining, biting hail of bullets in the water. He forgot an almost insane urge to keep his eyes on the sentry. He hid his face in the crook of his arm and lay still again. It seemed hours before Tien Pao at last allowed himself to lift his head and fearfully look back. The village was gone. This was new country, completely unknown to him. Tien Pao looked ahead. The river had become fearfully wide and straight. It must be going straight to the sea now. With the wideness of the river, the current had spread. The sampan seemed to move more slowly. Straight ahead was a deep bay in the bank of the river. There the water seemed almost quiet. Tien Pao grabbed the dishpan. Stretching flat on his face in the back of the sampan, he held the dishpan at a sharp angle down in the water. With the dishpan as a rudder, the sampan slowly began to respond. Slowly, in a seemingly endless curve, it turned towards the quiet bay. At last the sampan rode into the wide, shallow bay. There was a scraping of sand and gravel as it ground to a stop near the shore. Tien Pao scooped up the swimming ducklings and set them in the dishpan in the river. He grabbed the little pig, the bowl of watery rice, and jumped into the shallow water. With the rice bowl in one hand, pushing the dishpan ahead of him with the other hand, and tugging Glory of the Republic, splashing snout deep, behind him, Tien Pao hurried to the silent shore. The ducklings in the dishpan peered up at Tien Pao with their black beads of eyes. They peeped excited little whispers up at him. Tien Pao stopped. But he couldn't carry a dishpan and ducklings over the mountains. Ducklings were food. If he wrung their necks, he could sling them over his shoulder, and he'd have food for days. The thought of the 3 ducklings hanging limp over his shoulder was all of a sudden too much for Tien Pao. He looked at the ducklings. Then he shut his eyes tight and gave the dishpan a hard shove back into the bay. Without looking back, Tien Pao climbed up from the river and up the first rocky cliff. On top of the cliff, Tien Pao turned. The empty sampan had pulled back into the current. It was going down the river. Below in the bay, the white dishpan drifted and twirled. 2 ducklings swam in the dishpan, but one must have gone overboard with Tien Pao's hard, blind shove. The little duckling was chasing the dishpan, scrambling desperately to get out of the big river back into its little dishpan home. When he saw that, Tien Pao's lips trembled. He turned away and looked no more towards the river. And now we'll take a break. Before we move into chapter 3, where it looks as if there's some more children. Night in the Mountains. Okay, that's it for now.